Good morning in the US and good evening to our friends from India. Today is a special day because we do have a very special guest with us. Before I introduce him, I do like to say a few words, however. We are Global Indian Progressive Alliance, JIPA, and we are dedicated to India's foundational values and committed to bringing together people of Indian origin globally to contribute as a progressive alliance towards building progressive communities. Importantly enough, we are also grounded in scientific, evidence based research driven by the pursuits of facts, liberty, rationality, advocacy, and social justice. As we understand, the world is grappling with a unique year that none of us have witnessed it ever in our lifetimes. So, we do have an opportunity to make some good, positive, and progressive shared values together. Today, we are living in a world which has declared pandemic in COVID-19, but we are also living in the era of unidentified and in fact often overlooked pandemic of anti-intellectualism, radicalism, majoritarianism, and overall a deep divide between different communities based on simple human characteristics. And that, my friends, holds our progress back severely. In India, we see those divisions based on caste, religion, what have you. And in the US, we see divisions based on race as one of the predominant factors today. The brutal killing of an African American male, George Floyd, by a police officer has brought the entire country to a standstill once again. Invariably, it has also brought attention to our role as Indian Americans in the US and what role we must play in those important conversations. To answer those, we wanted to revisit India's foundational values woven in the spirit of the father of our nation, Mahatma Gandhi, and that brings us to today's session. At JIPA, we have also released a public statement, Solidarity with BLM Movement, with a 10-point action plan. The statement can be downloaded from our social media on Twitter. As an extension of our ongoing efforts, however, JIPA is now very pleased to host Dr. Shashi Tharoor this weekend in partnership with Young India. Dr. Tharoor wears many hats, from being an internationally acclaimed UN diplomat to one of the most prolific authors from India and now an Indian Congress politician par excellence. He will be discussing with us the role of Gandhian teachings amidst the BLM movement and the majoritarian politics as it influences both the US and India in their unique ways. At this point, I will turn over the microphone to my colleague Rohit Tripathi from Young India and let him take over. However, we would also like to welcome Dr. Shashi Tharoor on the floor. We appreciate your time and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Manish.
Thank you, Manish. Dr. Tharoor, welcome. Quick few words about Young India. We are a policy advocacy team that focuses on enriching the political discourse with ideas from various vantage points, especially the grassroots. We are one channel for civil society to engage and ultimately develop political leadership. Our name comes from Gandhi's newsletter that he started when he arrived back in India from South Africa in 1915. We are committed to the study and education of nonviolence as a methodology for social transformation. So Dr. Tharoor, once again, welcome to this forum organized by Young India and the Global Indian Progressive Alliance. I do want to start off with one remembrance, as most of you may have heard. Sadly, last night, we all lost one of the greatest proponents of nonviolence, Congressman John Lewis, who we had the privilege of hosting as a part of a Gandhi event we did many, many years ago on the Hill. His passion for Gandhi cannot be put into words. You just have to watch it. So as we start, we keep Congressman Lewis's family in our prayers and commit ourselves to carry the torch for peace, justice, and above all, reconciliation forward. So let's start right there with nonviolence. The American and Indian connection when it comes to the methodology of social transformation has had a long history that some may not know. So Dr. Tharoor, the first question for you is, and the first request is, do you mind sharing your views on that connection, specifically the connection between Thoreau, Gandhi, and King?
Right. Well, first of all, Rohit, you're right. It was tragically appropriate that we're meeting today when we lost Congressman John Lewis last night, not just a prominent civil rights leader and a close friend and colleague of Martin Luther King, but also somebody who was deeply influenced by Gandhi and his teachings. He followed in King's footsteps and traveled to India in 2009. And he said very interesting things about Gandhiji and Martin Luther King together. And if I can quote in his memory, one of his important observations, and I quote here, the two men were not politicians or lawmakers. They were not presidents or popes, but they inspired human beings who believed deeply in the power of nonviolent resistance to resistance to injustice as a tool for social change. Because of their courage, commitment, and vision, this nation, by which he means the US, has witnessed a non-violent revolution under the rule of law, a revolution of values and ideas that have changed America forever, unquote. And that's basically the answer to your question. It's striking that, that Congressman Lewis introduced or co-sponsored Bill H.R. 5517 last year on the occasion of the 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. And he actually talked on that occasion about the legacy of Gandhiji in America, the important commonalities between Gandhiji and Martin Luther King, and the bill included the establishment of the Gandhi King Development Foundation as an important element of fostering greater friendship between our countries. Now, his passing obviously is the end of an era. Ironically, yesterday we also lost another exponent of civil rights and nonviolent pursuit of civil rights, the Reverend Cordy Tyndall. It's interesting that the whole business of this discussion today is taking place in a world in which the rise of demagoguery, chauvinist nationalism, and populism across the world has been the defining feature of the last few years. It really is quite striking that where you had the moral man in terms of King or Gandhi, we now have the strong man instead. And it's particularly striking. You asked me, of course, to talk about the connection between the two of them specifically. In fact, you'd also asked me to think a little bit about Tharoor, yes. Henry David Tharoor, who yes. In many ways unites Gandhi King in America, because his idea of civil disobedience, formulated during his own opposition to the Mexican-American War and so on in the 1840s, profoundly influenced Mahatma Gandhi, who in turn profoundly influenced Martin Luther King. The idea of disobeying unjust laws, but facing the punishment for them, and promoting nonviolent resistance to injustice was common to all three of them. And if you look at three principal commonalities in their common brand of civil disobedience, one is the need to maintain the respect for the rule of law, even while you disobey the specific law that was perceived to be unjust.
That's right.
Gandhiji, for example, was very taken with Socrates' respect for Athenian law. You know that when Socrates was in prison, about to be executed by hemlock the next day, the prison guards were bribed by his followers and said, "Let the old man out." And Socrates said, "No, that would be a breaking of the law, and I'm not here to break the law." So he stayed in jail. Similarly, Gandhiji said in one of his early trials, "I'm here to submit cheerfully to the highest penalty that can be inflicted upon me for what in your law is a deliberate crime, but what appears to me to be the highest duty of a citizen." So that was a very interesting willingness to accept the consequences of one's violation of the law, the unjust laws imposed by the rulers. Another is, of course, you convert the opponent by demonstrating the justice of your cause, not by attacking the opponent, but by appealing to their moral conscience. And there you find, for example, that Gandhiji chose instead to inflict suffering upon himself to show how unjust the oppression was. By abstaining from violence, Gandhiji wrested the moral advantage. By breaking the law, non-violently exposed the injustice of the law. By accepting the punishments imposed on him, he confronted his captors, his oppressors, with their own brutalization. And by voluntarily imposing suffering upon himself in his hunger strikes, his fasts in jail, and so on, he demonstrated the lengths to which he was prepared to go in defense of what he considered to be morally right. And that's what made the perpetuation of British rule an impossibility. And Martin Luther King was hugely inspired by them. He attended a lecture on Gandhi. That's where he first heard about Gandhi. Bought half a dozen books on him, adopted Satyagraha as both precept and method. And I think he's probably the preeminent example, though clearly not the only one, of the use of Gandhian techniques and nonviolence most effectively outside India. In breaking down segregation, he said, hate begets hate, violence begets violence. We must meet the forces of hate with soul force. So what is soul force? That's satyagraha. And Martin Luther King also said the Gandhian method of nonviolent resistance became his guiding light. He said, Christ, remember, King was a Christian preacher. Christ furnished the spirit and motivation, and Gandhi furnished the method. And I was very struck. I was in the audience when President Barack Obama came to India in 2011, addressed the joint meeting of our parliament. And he said, if it were not for Gandhi, I would not be standing here as the American president. I think that's something that is, again, something that links the three countries together remarkably. And I would say that that probably summarizes the key issues that I would use in responding to your question.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor. And it's interesting that, this is the connection that we were showing as an alternative way back when the civil nuclear deal was being proposed, as we should really establish a relationship between India and the United States on geostrategic lines. And our pitch from Young India was that already exists through this incredible connection. Manish, you have a follow-up for Dr. Tharoor?
No, I think my follow-up question to that would be, in 2020, where do you see the role of his teachings in today's times? How these brought the communities together. So what do you have to say on that?
Well, the teachings are relevant, but the challenges are greater, because there's no question that Gandhiji is living in what the cynics have already dubbed a post-truth world. And how do you promote moral certitudes like ahimsa and satyagraha in an era in which even truth, satya, his key principle, is up for grabs? He applied both those concepts very profoundly to his work, but there's no question that we are seeing a time when the respect for truth is not what it used to be. The respect for nonviolence certainly is not what it used to be, though in fact one could argue that thanks to the overweening power of the strong men, nonviolence is the only effective means available, because violence is always going to be ineffective against the far more superior violence of those in power. And I think it's interesting that if you look at something like the Black Lives Matter protests, clearly what you're seeing is a Gandhian move. I discount the aberrations like the looting of storefronts because there wasn't a Gandhian figure to stop it. There were local Gandhian figures who stopped some of these things, but for the most part, the Black Lives Matter movement, whether it's in America or in the many other countries around the world that have done similar things, have followed the politics of protest of Gandhiji and so on. But even beyond Black Lives Matter, look at the environmental protests of Greta Thunberg. Look at the protest for education of girls by Malala Yousafzai. Look at other protest movements calling for justice. I think you're looking at a number of movements, including even those using new platforms like social media, that are essentially embodying Gandhian strategies. I often used to joke that Gandhiji would have actually been perfect for the Twitter age, because so many of his most memorable statements were in less than 140 characters. My life is my message. It's as pungent a tweet as you can get.
Right.
And I think there's no question that the great challenge is he brought moral imperative into mass politics. He brought a resistance to the organized violence of the state, which is obviously very, very strong. And I think I myself have applied the criticism that his methods worked best against governments that were capable of being shamed. In other words, democracies with a free press, because then they were confronted with the reality of their own conduct, and because they were made ashamed by the methods of Gandhi, to change. So wouldn't have worked against the Nazis. I think if you went to Hitler and said, I'm prepared to suffer, Hitler will very cheerfully accept your suffering as a vindication of his own triumph. So Nazism, some of these genocidal ideologies may not be the best targets for Gandhiji. But this post-truth age we're talking about is also an age of social media, of information overload, of information revolution, and therefore your ability to influence oppressive governments and even strongmen through the project of shame and through the activities that they are confronted with on the international media stage in the information age, I think that may actually help, because I think that the Gandhian method relied a lot on free information. Now, the problem in the post-truth age is that truth and falsehood often flourish at the same time. But I think that the moral force that Gandhiji brought to his advocacy of truth would have made him a spiritual warrior in a way that would have put him above the purveyors of falsehood and fake news. And I think that's precisely where you would have been able to see effective resistance through Gandhian methods to the exploitative and deepening inequality in so many societies, racism that we've talked about already in the US and elsewhere, but particularly I think with BLM in the US. The thing that Gandhi often railed against was the wide gulf between the rich and the hungry millions, as he put it. And Gandhiji was quite cynical about the media. He said that very often newspapers are dishonest, and he is right. They are, and we're seeing that today in the world ourselves. So when Gandhi spoke of people being exploited, even under the name of democracy, he was truly a rebel and a protester himself. And I would argue that that's the method that could prevail even in the post-truth age of today, thanks to the fact that the post-truth age is also an age of information in the broadest sense.
So I want to go a little off script, Manish, so pardon me for this. So Dr. Tharoor, I mean, one thing I did want to pinpoint was that when we study Gandhian transformation and the framework that I shared with you, specifically what Gene Sharp has done at Harvard, its protest is almost at the final stages of a nonviolent movement. There's a lot of preparation that has to go in, not just for the tactical moves, but also understanding of the issue, the development of leadership, the articulation of a broader program. Could you talk a lot to our specifically to our younger folks and people who are getting initiated in the nonviolence of today, the preparation you need to come with, in addition to the moral clarity you need to have, but also the intellectual clarity you need to have to be successful in a movement that is based on nonviolence?
Well, you're venturing onto slippery ground here because of some of the challenges we're seeing. I mean, I have, as you probably are aware, I have actually attacked the government in India for its misuse of Gandhi as symbol rather than substance. We have seen, for example, that Gandhiji's moral precepts have been resolutely ignored by the government. His teachings about, for example, equal treatment of people of all faiths have been ignored by this government. But they have taken his glasses as the symbol of the Swachh Bharat campaign. And I said, reducing the Mahatma Gandhi to his glasses is actually a metaphor for the way they have reduced Gandhiji sort of without his moral content into merely a token, into merely a symbol. So it's a challenging time now. You see him on billboards for, I think, IBM and Apple and so on, at least you're used to advertising his simplicity and his directness. You see his glasses on Swachh Bharat. You see quotations from him all over the place. But what you don't see, I think, is substance other than the marketability of the image. And that's something that really, really troubles me. In fact, in particular in India, we have this challenge that the RSS BJP school of thought had historically been very negative on Gandhiism and particularly on nonviolence and ahimsa. In fact, M.S. Golwalkar, the longest serving Sarsan Chalak of the RSS, famously said, what is all this talk about nonviolence? It's anti-Hindu. Every Hindu god has a weapon. And that's the sort of very different view. So essentially, because they don't agree with Gandhi on substance, but they don't want to lose the brand, they have kept the glasses and the hypocrisy of the token. That's the first challenge we have. So it's seemingly the appearance is one of continued relevance and continued reverence, but the substance is not there. The second challenge we have is from the opposite end of the spectrum. Many of you must be aware of the Gandhi Must Fall campaign. His statue was removed outside the University of Accra. There's a campaign by the students of the University of Manchester, led by a girl of Pakistani origin in Britain, asking the city council to remove his statue. And the argument is based on a few remarks very early in his career, in his mid-20s in South Africa, alleging racism because he fought for the rights of Indians but disparaged the so-called Kafirs, which is a rude word in those days for Black Africans. And the fact is that this is a travesty of his record. He grew up, I mean, everyone in the 20s makes mistakes, to make very much common cause with the Black Africans in their struggle for rights. He's made many more speeches supporting them and their cause than he has made remarks of disparagement. And at the same time, he's also spoken up very strongly in favor of Black rights in South Africa and elsewhere, even in America. He long corresponded, for example, with Du Bois, H.E.W. Du Bois, and he had read and been inspired by the writings of Frederick Douglass. This is not a man, Booker T. Washington as well. So this is not a man who was indifferent or even negative, as people falsely allege, to blacks. But it was important to understand that Gandhiji is being attacked from both sides by those who seemingly exalt him from positions of power, but in fact undermine him by reducing him of substance, by divesting him of substance, and those who attack him on the false understanding that he was himself in any way a racist. And I think these are two challenges that those of us who support his ideals and his moral values must actually confront, because these are the counter blasts that are coming at us. I think with Gandhiji, you need substance, you need absolute focus on both the method and the teachings. You need an absolute respect for the moral and spiritual content of the man's ideas. And at the same time, as I said earlier, you need an opponent who's capable of being shamed by being confronted by their own moral inadequacies. All of these are not always available. And I would say that just as there is no one size fits all solution to any problem on the planet, even Gandhian nonviolence will not fit every solution and every opponent. Will not fit every challenge and every opponent. It's a solution for the most part, but it requires those basic understandings to be able to be applied effectively.
Manish.
Sure. Well, that was an excellent response, Dr. Tharoor. I've always learned that truth and oil always comes to the surface. We just need to work a bit harder to bring the truth out, particularly in today's post-truth world, as you mentioned. I want to shift this question now, since you were mentioning about majoritarianism early in your conversation. One question, and it's a two-part question, so bear with me on that, please. One question is, how do you define the majoritarianism? What's the understanding of the role of majoritarianism in shaping today's dark realities of institutional and systemic discrimination, and particularly in polarizing the communities? That's the part one question. And the second part question to that I have is on the growing, people often call about the fascist ideas, which often correlate parallels with majoritarianism. We understand that fascists strive for absolute power. They're not even above the non-parliamentary approach to achieve their goals. So where do you see these parallels, and where do you see India today in that broader context?
Okay, well, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the second question perfectly, but we can come back to that. On majoritarianism, it's simply a political approach that basically asserts that the majority, in India's case, it's the Hindu majority defined essentially by their religion. In Quebec, it might be the French majority. In some other society, say South Africa under apartheid, it was the white minority, so it was actually against the black majority, so that's not a good example. But you can find majority groups in many societies defined by religion, defined by language, defined by social class, race, whatever identifying factor, that they should enjoy primacy in society and in the state. They should have the right to make the decisions that affect the society, because obviously, from their point of view, the state has spent too long in appeasing, as they call it, the minorities, and that's been their traditional approach. Now, for myself, I've been an opponent of majoritarianism in the Indian context, because I do believe that it is undemocratic not to put constraints on what majorities can do, because the fundamental rights of citizens, both as individuals and as members of social groups, would be affected if one particular majority is essentially always able to prevail. Nehru, for example, would consistently argue that as far as he was concerned, that he found communalism a greater danger than any other danger to the state, because he said that the majority can always conflate its interests with that of the nation. And that's exactly what we have seen. I mean, years after, 6 decades after he's passed away practically, we are seeing a government that says a disagreement with its majoritarian approach is anti-national. That's precisely the sort of challenge that you face with a majority. It's very easy for a majority to conflate its own interests with that of the nation, and thereby discredit others. And particularly when you're looking at the need to preserve the civic rights excuse me, of individuals, of communities who do not identify with the majority, whether religious grounds, linguistic grounds, whatever, then you're facing a genuine problem. I'm sorry, Manish, I didn't fully catch the second question. Give me a summary of it.
Sure, I can repeat that. The second question was related to the context of the parallel between majoritarianism and fascism. We talk about like how the fascists strive for absolute power. They're not above the non-parliamentarian approach to achieve their goals. They're overtly nationalistic, militaristic, and expansionist. So where do you see the parallel between the majoritarianism and fascism, and particularly where we also unfortunately see somewhat, pardon me for saying that, neutering of the opposition voices, whether it's in the parliament or outside the parliament. So where do you see that in the broader context of India, and particularly how we move forward as a progressive communities?
Manish, I've been careful not to use the word fascism, because in the years since Hitler and Mussolini, it's just become a term of abuse.
Sure.
And therefore, you shut down the possibility of dialogue when you use words that can immediately lead others to sort of close their minds to your critique.
Fair
but
enough.
I will admit that there are a number of critiques. It's a very good essay I would recommend to you by Umberto Eco on the elements of fascism. In my forthcoming book on India's nationalism and how it's gone under a very severe strain from the civic nationalism embedded in the liberal constitutionalism of the Indian Constitution to the majoritarian Hindutva of the present government, I would say that you're looking at in a startlingly large number of those elements are popping up again. In particular, the identification of the interests of the majority with the nation, the hollowing out of independent institutions that can resist this, the promoting of a cult, almost a militaristic cult of muscularity, and in India's case, it's the 56-inch chest of the prime minister that's extolled. You've got there are many, many others, the rejection of free media, the discrediting of the opposition. All of those things are there. And you raise the question of the opposition. It's a genuine challenge, because obviously majoritarianism is not synonymous with majority rule. You can win a free and fair election and have a majority in parliament, and you have the right to rule. But we're talking about how the state is structured so that whatever the size of your majority in parliament, the rights of the percentage that has not voted for you are also respected. And in the case of India, with multiple political parties, the BJP won its first election with 31% of the vote,
Right.
and the second election with 37% of the vote. So even though their popularity is going up, they are by no means the majority of the country's political opinion. However, they have a majority in parliament. Now, what happens normally in these situations, and we know that both Rajiv Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru had bigger majorities than Mr. Modi has, is that they both promoted, nurtured, and protected the independent institutions that could hold their power in check, whether it was by respecting parliament, by the fearlessness of the judiciary to challenge them, whether it was the free press that attacked them, and indeed whether it was the opposition parties that rose against them. All of these things created an alternative set of views, and they gave outlets. If you think of a state as a pressure cooker, the valve was periodically opened through these different independent institutions. So one of the things that worries me today is the way in which these institutions are also being compromised in India. I would say the opposition has not been neutered. It has, to some degree, found its voice late last year in the extraordinary, spontaneous, by the way, not opposition organized, but spontaneous mass protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act. And if it were not for the COVID lockdown, which shut down all these protests, the opposition was gaining momentum. I'm confident that when this pandemic is behind us and the nation wakes up to face the reality of the mismanagement of the pandemic, the disastrous economic situation with the worst unemployment figures in the history of India since numbers got to be recorded, and at the same time, the very serious menace of China across the line of actual control, when the public sees all of that, they will themselves welcome a renewed and reinvigorated opposition.
Well, I can assure you on behalf of the Indian Americans that we do stand with the opposition forces in many strands. And at this point, I'd like to turn over to Rohit also if he has a follow-up on the comments Dr. Tharoor made.
Manish, thank you so much. And Dr. Tharoor, I'm glad for two things that you just mentioned. Number one, the how mathematically weird it is that the majoritarianism that is being demonstrated by a minority within the majority. So thanks for pointing that out. So maybe all hope is not completely lost there. I wanted to kind of move into another dimension of the topic that we want to discuss today, and that is action. So what are the three fundamental things that you think are precise things that if changed in India, would lead us to the promised land? Three specific things.
I don't think that really any answer would be comprehensive enough. But there's no question, for example, that politics is part of the problem, and I'm in politics. So let me say that we do need to deal with our system of political representation effectively. Some of you may know that for 20 years, I've been advocating that India shift to what in shorthand is called a presidential system. But what I really mean is one of directly elected chief executives everywhere. We have a system that privileges inefficiency, most unfortunately, and that also, as a result, permits these unnatural situations like the result of 37% of the vote presuming to speak for 80% of the country, because they claim to do so in the name of the community whose interests they advocate. Now, these are the kinds of challenges we have. If you are directly elected chief executives in the states, in the center, and a genuine separation of powers, where you actually had a legislature that was not necessarily reflective of the power of the elected president, then you would have a president or a chief executive accountable to the executive, with his or her power balanced by the power of equally powerful elected chief executives or chief ministers in the states. And you would also have a truly independent judiciary. And at the same time, you would not have the inefficiencies that come from what we're seeing in India shamefully over the last year and a bit, of the BJP literally trying to buy legislators in order to get cobble together majorities in states they've lost, which is a complete travesty of democracy. But that's exactly what's happening now because of the deeply flawed parliamentary system, which in my view is perfect for a tiny island state like Britain, but is completely unsuitable for ours. At some point, I'll sit down and write about that. Yeah, it's one thing. The other one is, of course, the question of how we strengthen our independent institutions. I think we need to absolutely ensure that all these institutions, whether it's the Reserve Bank, whether it's the judiciary, whether it's the Fourth Estate, whether it's the Election Commission, one can give you 20 other examples of institutions that in design were meant to be truly independent. If they can be made genuinely independent by reducing the government's power to control their appointment, their terms of office, and so on, or separating it. In America, for example, the executive can't appoint a judge alone. The Senate also has to confirm. That sort of thing, creating a process in which more than one voice will be there. So you have an interest in appointing people to these institutions who will truly be independent, be committed to the institution rather than to the ruling party. And then we need mechanisms to strengthen social justice and human rights. Sadly, the enormous gulfs in our country, whether it's a gulf between the rich and the poor, I know that sounds like a cliche, but sadly, it remains true. We've a proud record that between 2005 and 15, according to a recent UN study released this week, that we've had the best record of pulling people out of poverty, 270 million people. But that still leaves over 230 million people below the poverty line. And sadly, the economic crisis that this government has presided over in recent years may have pushed some of these people back below the poverty line. So looking after the needs of the weak, the vulnerable, and the poor is extremely important. Mm-hmm. And linked to that notion of social justice is also human rights, because you can also have social injustice when it comes to people being denied opportunities or housing or jobs or whatever because of their religion, or because of which part of the country they come from, or which language they speak. So I think that the challenges for us in dealing with majoritarianism in India is precisely to strengthen all those who don't fit into the ruling Hindutva, Hindustan, Hindi triad, which is the ruling motto. Hindi, Hindutva, Hindustan is the usual slogan. That idea is something which clearly leaves out an awful lot of people. It leaves out much of the South and the Northeast that doesn't speak Hindi. It leaves out much of the country who happen not to identify as Hindus, and it leaves out the bits of the nation that don't fit into the Aryavrata notion of Hindustan, the northern Hindi-speaking cow belt of India. And the fact is that if we allow a parliamentary majority to reduce India to that, we will actually threaten the unity of India, because a lot of people will ask openly what some are muttering in the South and elsewhere, saying, why should we be part of a notion of nation that excludes us so willfully? And this is something that I think we really need to be alert to. I worry, for example, that when the constitutional amendment, which has frozen political representation at the levels of the 1971 census, which was then renewed by Atal Bihari Vajpayee's government without debate, but which is now expiring in 2026, and which certainly the people around Mr. Modi don't look likely to renew, you will suddenly get the disenfranchisement of all the states that have actually empowered their women, educated their children, reduced their population sizes, and certainly eliminated population growth as a significant factor. Those states will be punished by being politically disenfranchised in favor of the failing states that have actually incarnated a lot of these worst elements and given us the majoritarianism that the ruling party celebrates. And I think there will be a tremendous amount of resistance if that were to happen, unless far-seeing minds sit together and discuss an effective way of resolving this conundrum so that India's future is not imperiled. I fear we're really going to be in a genuine problem. I will have to leave you there, but thank you so much for having me. And it really was a stimulating and important theme that you picked up. I wish you all good luck. Many of you I know are, at least the organizers, are based in America, based abroad. And I think those affinities are going to be very important, because as we all know, the assumption is that overseas friends of the BJP is what's supposed to be typical and representative of the mainstream in
Good to
our
hear.
community. And I think your existence and that of Sam Pitroda's Indian Overseas Congress and other groups gives the lie to that presumption. So keep up the good work, stand up for the right values.
Thank you,
good luck in what you do.
Well, thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you so
Tharoor,
much.
for joining in. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time and going a little ahead. We'll be in touch with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. All the best.
Bye-bye. All right. Well, at this point, we do have about 12 minutes left into our hourly schedule. So we do want to take questions from our chat window if there are other people. So maybe we can ask a question back and forth between Rohit and myself here. Rohit, are you up for that?
Yeah, I'm totally up for it.
All right, I'll take your area here. It says Gandhi was, I'm just picking up randomly here from Indira Raj. She asked, Gandhi was true to himself as truth is God for him. Are today's followers or practitioners of Gandhian thought are? And can they be made to explore themselves to such an extent towards inwardness?
You know, that's a very personal question. And I think, you know, I don't have any moral authority to comment on other people's own reflection, because I myself am a pretty flawed man. But I think that's the beauty of, I think, you know, we've talked about this when you compare sustaining movements, good or bad, actually. So, you know, the example I typically give is the RSS and the Indian independence movement. Both movements have had two things, rather three things. The two fundamental pieces are they both have had certain type of discipline. So what I call in Hindi Anushasan, and then the other have Vichardhara, which I call, you know, which is basically ideology. And of course, you know, we know what we disagree with the RSS ideology completely, but the fact that they do have an ideology, no matter how morally bankrupt or whatever it is, that's a part. But that's a chief characteristic. But inherent in the discipline piece of both of these things, and we saw this, you know, in my grandfather's generation. I mean, he was a freedom fighter from Bundelkhand. That discipline provided a lot of self-development and forced a lot of reflection. And so that's something that if you really want to be part of a movement of nonviolence or effective movement of nonviolence, or you think that we have to be starting a movement that is nonviolent, or you want to bring nonviolence into your movement, that discipline is essential. I mean, it absolutely is essential for your own good. Because if you don't feel good about yourself, you know, then I think you can't really lead a meaningful movement. And that's a struggle that, you know, billions have every day, including us. that pursuit for self-development is so critical. And self-development, not that, you know, I don't want to do, today I did 10 pull-ups, tomorrow I want to do 20 pull-ups, or, you know, it's not that manifestation. It's a truly reflective approach. And, you know, whether it's yoga, you do yoga, whether you are religious, you know, Gandhiji used to say that my goal is not to convert people, but to make them better followers of their own religion. So wherever you seek solace, wherever you seek spiritual guidance, I think, and of course, you know, the sources of spiritual guidance that easily transfer to your moral view of the world, just dive deeper into that. I mean, that's what I would say, you know. I'm still searching for good sources. So if anybody has any ideas, please share them.
Right. All right. There's another question that I probably would take on and then have you also answer. It says that from Ritesh Kumar saying, why is there a rise in right-wing politics in all over the world, which does not believe in Gandhian philosophy? To me, I mean, this is something that I have been writing also for a long time now. One of the things that I have observed and read about is that how the nationalistic, or rather I would call it hyper-nationalistic politics, comes as part of this whole narrative building of the right-wing base. And that is where we have often, you know, found where people unite on those ideas, which are not rooted on logic, on rationality, on science, you know, and that's where we see a lot of trouble, where people then connect together on everyday activities. So I feel that the rise in the national right-wing politics, we can also base it on the decline of the intellectualism, you know, the decline of a grounded thought in what we do, how we do. You know, a lot of people would say that, you know, things that happen today, whether there's a lot of parallels between BJP government's politics and whether it's Trump's politics. You know, we've written about that also. There's a lot of stark parallelism in that. You see how they also ground their political shifts in polarizing the communities. And that's one thing that, we have been very vocal at JIPA to talk about, that people need to understand that, we move forward as societies when we are collaborating on different ideas together, on progressive ideas together. And to us, the progressive ideas is kind of moving forward in where, Dr. Tharoor talked about the 230 million people who are living below the poverty line or hungry, hunger line. How can we move forward, on those ideas? Where do we see India of 2050? Where do we see India of 2090? Those are the people in 2019 who have not been even born yet, for most part. What is their what's up to them? Why are they going to be living in poverty? And if they do, we as a society, we as our generation would have failed in. So we also have to connect to those ideas as a progressive communities, where we look into the political shifts and how the political shift get into power by polarization, not by any progressive ideas. And that's easy to get that. People do win those elections. We see that. We have seen that happen in the last two elections in India, or whether it's in the United States also. So we really have to see ourselves building a movement that is grounded in facts, that is grounded in rationality, in science, in logic. So hopefully, once we get to that power, and that's where we can see the right-wing politics, at least the far right-wing politics, will probably get subsided. Also countering the hyper-nationalism, because we are into this mode of protectionism, right? Everybody is like, okay, we want to just watch out for ourselves. But we know that since 1990, since India's markets opened up, globalized, post-globalization period, we can't survive as a community, can't survive as a country just living in our own little cocoon. We all work together. And that's where I feel that we have to find some synergy to get things moving on. What do you think, Rohit?
So my answer is pretty straightforward. I think elementally, and I've kind of thought about this for a while, because I grew up in Delhi, late 80s, early 90s. I saw the Ran Janan Bhoomi movements go up and reach its crescendo, the demolition. And so I've been tracking the rise of India's right wing in this latest incarnation for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing here. I lived through in the United States through 9/11 and what followed after that internally here. And my one-word answer to the problem is curiosity. Any society that gives up on curiosity, not curiosity. Curiosity is not gossip. Curiosity about the world, about nature, you talk about science. So what is science at the end of the day? Right, we are looking at what are the natural laws of the universe, right? I mean, there has to be.
Right. I mean, to me, it's a systemic inquiry of our world around us, right?
There's the methodology piece, but the methodology piece is preceded by a genuine curiosity to even know anything, and that's where things are different. So it's a sequence. If you're not interested in finding something out, or you're not interested in something, then you won't even follow the methodology. But the goal is to, this is where education is such a critical part. And that's where, if we ever get a chance to get Dr. Tharoor back, that's what we want to focus on, right? We want to focus on what are the ultimate elements of human dignity, right? What are the driving forces? Things like social mobility, access to capital. These are the building blocks of any society, right?
Social justice, advocacy, right?
Yeah. A massive hierarchy at the end of the day, right? How do we secure those basic things? And what is the, I thank everybody for joining in, and I think as we too have we have another million questions for him, and we're going to try to get him back again. Hopefully he enjoyed this webinar, and I want to thank everybody for thanking us. Question that I know we have certain answers. People are asked questions regarding BLM to the Dalit movements in India, and absolutely, I think the funny part is, as Dr. Tharoor said, right, the so-called majority voice isn't a majority voice even in India, right? Hinduism Hindu society is so, I won't say fragmented, but so diverse, and trying to homogenize just even that society, is very difficult. And I think what we need to, push, we always say that people in different parts of India, should try to maintain the local traditions, right? There's a push to homogenize things, and hopefully, we give people support, show solidarity, that it is okay to be who you are. If these are your customs and rituals, keep them. Don't just borrow it from everybody else at the expense of your own traditions, be it your language, be it your dialect. Learn more languages, of course, but don't let Hindi be the only language that you end up speaking. We all know from neuroscience that the value of learning more languages. Anyway, so
Yeah,
human dignity, we'll come back to human dignity one day, hopefully.
right. And I do want to say that, as I just want to reinforce Dr. Tharoor's last point, people may think that there is a large voice, whether it's from the friends of XYZ or what have you. There isn't. There is a lot of progressive voices, even in America, that can amplify the voices back in India and that do progressive work in India also, and including in America. So that is something that, was why we came, how we became what we became. So it is important for us to recognize that and to collaborate and to join hands. Basically, we have to build a progressive movement moving forward. And I hope that these are some baby steps that we are taking forward, and hopefully we'll get support from as many people who are in the webinar or couldn't join, or those who like to follow our work. So at this point, I do want to thank our team also. Lisa, Dinu, Som, Dave, particularly, the behind the scenes here. So thank you for that. And thank you for Rohit from Young India for obviously coming in and giving his wisdom, and with Dr. Tharoor.
Wisdom.
So, wisdom, yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So, all right. I think at this point we should formally call the day. The recording will be available on facebook.com/GIPA Alliance. So please do follow us on that. Rohit, over to you.
Yeah, so I mean, my final thought would be, as folks here, especially in the United States or anywhere else in the world, have seen that at least there are two forums here, and we're friends, where if you want to engage, being part of the diaspora, please reach out. If we don't have what your interests are, we know enough people around us who can absorb your needs to be engaged, can give you pathways to engage, and we highly recommend that you do that. Our information is there. If anybody wants to write to us, we are at info@yidream.org. Manish is easily found. We're all over the place. So if anybody wants to reach out to us about anything that we discussed today, or you have any other interest from an issue area standpoint, I am personally very interested in the methodology piece of it. Also, we are more focused on the long-term things, structural challenges within the Indian economy, structural challenges in the Indian society, Indian institutions. If you want to do a specialized project, say on panchayats in India, feel free to reach out to us. We are actively working with civil society groups in that domain, and we can connect you to folks where your channels can be utilized. So thanks again, Manish. Thanks again for this incredible opportunity. And of course, if Dr. Tharoor sees this recording, thanks to him for sparing the time, and we look forward to joining all of you again soon at something like this. Manish, thanks again.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. I'm going to formally close this out. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.